The alien's eyes narrowed as the glitter of the bracelet caught the artificial starlight spilling through the glass dome. It wasn't just any ornament, it was his, a gift forged in a private vault centuries ago, created from metals mined on worlds no human had ever set foot on. He had given it away in a moment of rare sentiment, meant for someone who had mattered once, long before empires and fortunes hardened his heart. Yet here it was, dangling loosely from the wrist of a ragged human, a nobody from a backwater world, stumbling through the gala as if they had wandered into a realm they had no right to belong. The alien billionaire's thoughts churned between disbelief, suspicion, and something far more dangerous, curiosity. The gala was the kind of event that only the richest and most powerful beings in the galaxy could ever hope to attend, a spectacle designed less for celebration and more as a demonstration of supremacy, of control, of who truly ruled the scattered civilizations of countless stars. The venue itself was an artificial dome suspended high above a glittering city that sprawled across the face of a jewel-like planet, a city built to be seen from orbit, its rivers of light weaving like constellations across the surface. Within the dome, the air shimmered faintly with controlled atmosphere, perfumed with scents imported from the gardens of alien worlds, some of them extinct everywhere else but preserved for the enjoyment of those who could pay for such luxuries. Beings of all shapes, sizes, and evolutionary backgrounds moved through the grand hall, their voices a polyphonic murmur beneath the music produced by an orchestra composed of living instruments, each one genetically engineered to emit perfect notes that resonated directly with the emotions of the listener. Wealth here was not measured in simple credits but in entire ecosystems owned, in the number of stars whose light was bent to serve as private lanterns, in relics of forgotten civilizations bought and sold not as history but as decor. The alien billionaire was at home in this world of extravagance, though even among such titans of commerce and empire, he stood apart. His name was whispered with reverence and envy, for his fortunes stretched across sectors, his holdings included fleets that could rival governments, and his influence extended further still, into the quiet, unspoken deals that determined which species rose and which were left to collapse. He was no longer impressed by gold, jewels, or rare resources, for these things flowed to him as naturally as air to lungs. What he craved, what he displayed, was rarity of meaning, things that carried weight not merely in value but in story. Around his neck hung a crystalline shard taken from the heart of a star's corpse, a memento of a sun extinguished by time. On his wrist rested an ancient band forged by a civilization wiped out before humans had even begun to dream of fire. Each possession was carefully chosen, a statement of not just wealth but power over time itself. Tonight was yet another opportunity to walk among rivals and allies alike, to be seen and remembered, to remind everyone that he, more than most, had bent the galaxy to his will. The gala floor gleamed with materials engineered to reflect not just light but memory, so that every step left behind a fleeting echo, a shadow of the walker's form that shimmered and dissolved, giving the illusion that history itself lingered underfoot. Towers of food floated on anti-gravity trays, each dish harvested from worlds so hostile that entire expeditions had been lost just to retrieve a single edible specimen. Drinks glowed faintly with bioluminescence, changing color with each sip depending on the emotions of the one who consumed them. Conversations rippled through the air, conducted in 1,000 languages, though most guests were fitted with translation nodes that rendered everything into seamless understanding. Here deals were brokered over the flick of a claw or the brush of a tentacle, entire wars decided by a shared glance, alliances built and broken as easily as one might trade a cup of spiced nectar. And yet beneath all the splendor, there was tension. The presence of so many powerful beings always carried the unspoken reminder that every empire, no matter how secure, teetered on the edge of ambition. The alien billionaire observed it with practiced calm, his golden eyes sweeping the hall with calculated indifference. To him this was not entertainment but strategy, a field of predators circling each other, cloaked in silks and jewels instead of claws and teeth. He had seen too much, gained too much, to be easily moved by the shallow displays of the others. They brought out trinkets dredged from black holes, servants bred to embody perfection, fleets announced with theatrical pride. All of it was expected, all of it was noise. Only something truly extraordinary could draw his attention, something that carried with it a resonance deeper than money, deeper than power. He shifted his posture on the raised platform where he stood, gazing down at the mingling crowd. Ambassadors draped in the colors of entire star systems bowed to fit series who could collapse markets with a gesture. Artificial beings, sculpted to dazzle, entertained clusters of dignitaries. One species unveiled a fragment of a moon carved into the shape of their sovereign's face, while another displayed a prisoner from a rival world, frozen in stasis, as if life itself were nothing but an ornament. Such displays elicited gasps, nods, applause, but he remained unmoved. His wealth was older, deeper, forged not just from acquisition but from the careful curation of meaning. He knew most of these would fade into irrelevance within centuries, their legacies swallowed by the tide of history, while his name, his legacy, would remain carved into the marrow of the galaxy. The lights above dimmed and brightened in rhythmic intervals, designed to emulate the heartbeat of a living creature, so that all within the dome felt subtly connected to a shared pulse. The alien billionaire listened but did not succumb to the intended illusion of unity. He had no need of such tricks. He existed apart, observing, measuring, calculating. Around him swirled laughter, bargaining, subtle threats wrapped in smiles. He sipped from a glass of liquid light, letting it ripple down his throat, and thought not of the present but of the past, for such gatherings always carried ghosts. Every gift he had given, every deal he had struck, every betrayal he had endured, they all lived within moments like this, echoes that rose when wealth and pride filled the air. He often wondered if others remembered as deeply, or if they were all trapped chasing new glories while forgetting the ones that had shaped them. For him, memory was the most valuable currency of all, rarer than any jewel, heavier than any crown, and it was this belief that guided how he moved among the galaxy's elite, his expression composed, his heart armored, his attention waiting for the one thing that could pierce it again. The alien billionaire's eyes, sharpened by centuries of habitually scanning the wealth of others with cold precision, drifted across the sea of treasures displayed throughout the gala. Everywhere he looked, there were artifacts meant to dazzle, meant to remind others that the owners possessed influence stretching far beyond mere planetary dominion. A crystalline globe holding storms from a gas giant perpetually raging within its glassy prison, a cloak woven from strands of comet tails, glowing faintly as if stitched with frozen lightning, weapons that hummed with restrained destruction, relics from wars so ancient their very participants were myths. He had seen countless such things before, each of them precious, each of them unique, and yet all of them had blended together into the same song of opulence. Nothing surprised him anymore, nothing quickened his pulse, nothing stirred the sense of awe that had once guided his younger years. His gaze was detached, a predator watching prey he had already devoured 1,000 times. But then, across the shifting brilliance of the crowd, a faint glimmer pulled his focus with uncharacteristic force. It was small compared to the ostentatious displays around it, almost unworthy of notice in such a setting, yet it burned into his perception like a beacon, a bracelet, no larger than a human wrist could carry, catching the artificial starlight of the dome in a way that no ordinary trinket ever could. To any other eye, it might have seemed an odd piece of jewelry, elegant but simple, gleaming faintly as though the metals themselves breathed. But to him, it was unmistakable. The curvature of the links, the delicate way the gemstones had been set to align with invisible constellations, the subtle shimmer of alloys no longer mined, crafted with techniques lost to entire civilizations, every detail whispered its identity. He knew this bracelet intimately, because it was not merely another piece of wealth. It was a fragment of his past, a remnant of a moment, when even he, before the mountains of riches and oceans of influence, had once given something away, not for politics, not for prestige but for sentiment. It had been forged long ago in a private vault on a barren asteroid, where he had commissioned artisans whose families had sworn their lives to his service. They had used metals dredged from the cores of collapsing stars, materials that sang faintly to the touch, alive in a way that only the oldest resources in the galaxy could be. The gemstones embedded within it had been harvested from the frozen rings of a dead world, their colors shifting with the angle of light, impossible to replicate, impossible to counterfeit. He had given the artisans one instruction: it was not to be gaudy, not to be a declaration of his wealth, but to be meaningful, something that carried elegance without arrogance, permanence without weight. When at last it had been finished, he had held it in his hands and known it was perfect, a symbol not of what he owned, but of what he could give. And he had given it, not to an empire, not to a rival to silence them, but to someone who had mattered, someone whose memory was now shrouded in a haze of time and regret. That gift had been private, unrecorded, forgotten by all save himself. It was never meant to return. Yet here it was, gleaming softly on the wrist of a figure who had no right to bear it. His breath stilled, though outwardly his face remained a mask of indifference. Inside, thoughts churned with icy violence. How had it come to be here? Who was wearing it now, flaunting it as if it were just another bauble among countless others? Slowly, carefully, his gaze shifted past the light to the owner, and the shock deepened into disbelief. It was not a wealthy dignitary or rival collector adorned with the bracelet. It was not one of his peers, nor some ancient being who might have earned it through twisted channels of inheritance or conquest. No, the bracelet encircled the thin wrist of a human, an unremarkable, ragged figure, whose very presence at the gala seemed like an anomaly. The human stood awkwardly among the tide of grandeur, dressed in garments that looked patched and ill-fitted compared to the silks and living fabrics draped around others. Their movements lacked the effortless grace of those born into power. Their eyes darted nervously as though expecting to be exposed, expelled, erased from the company they dared to occupy. The alien billionaire's mind surged with questions, layered atop each other like waves in a storm. Was it possible this human had stolen the bracelet? Could such a nobody have penetrated the endless vaults of collectors and dealers who traded in rarities like blood? Or perhaps it had been sold, passed down through unknowing hands until it landed here, degraded into nothing more than a trinket on the wrist of someone who did not and could not comprehend its history. Yet even as suspicion took hold, something deeper pushed against it. The human did not wear it with arrogance or awareness, but with the unconsciousness of one who regarded it as an ordinary possession, a thing not flaunted but carried. It sat there as naturally as if it belonged, as though it had always belonged, and that struck him harder than any theft or fraud could have. There was mystery here, one that clawed at the edges of his mind. Around him the gala continued unbroken. Voices still rose in laughter, deals were still struck, treasures still unveiled, yet to him the noise had receded, hollow and insignificant compared to the sight before him. All the wealth of the galaxy, all the posturing of rival billionaires and ancient dynasties, had become irrelevant in that single instant. His eyes locked on the bracelet, and through it, on the human who wore it. He could not look away. Memories, sharp and painful, surged upward unbidden. He remembered the one he had given it to, remembered the weight of that moment, the softness of a voice long silenced by time. It had not been a business transaction, not an exchange meant to secure advantage. It had been personal, uncalculated, a rare gesture of trust. That it had resurfaced here, in this place, carried by a human who looked as though they had stumbled into a dream they did not understand, was a collision of past and present that felt almost impossible, almost fated. He shifted his weight slightly, though none would notice, his posture still the image of composure. Inside, however, he felt the stirrings of something he had not allowed himself in centuries, curiosity mixed with the faintest thread of hope, tangled with suspicion, with longing, with a dangerous hunger to know more. For the first time in an age, his indifference cracked, and his focus narrowed to a single point. The bracelet gleamed faintly once more, catching the engineered starlight, as if it too recognized him, and whispered from across the crowd, calling him toward the human who bore it without understanding its worth, without knowing the history they carried unknowingly on their wrist. The human stood out like a misplaced fragment in a mosaic, a presence that seemed accidental, a shadow that had slipped into a hall of brilliance where every other guest radiated wealth and power. They moved hesitantly, with the kind of stiffness that betrayed not only discomfort, but a lifetime of unfamiliarity with spaces such as this. The hall shimmered around them, beings clad in garments that shifted color with every step, creatures whose very skin reflected the wealth of their species, voices booming with laughter or humming with coded intent, and in the midst of it, this human appeared fragile, almost translucent. Their clothes were clean but lacked the fine tailoring or adaptive fabrics that adjusted themselves to fit the body perfectly. Instead, the cloth hung loose in some places, pulled tight in others, betraying its second-hand nature. Their shoes were scuffed, their hair carried the uneven trim of someone who had cut it themselves, and their posture wavered between self-preservation and wonder. They were not supposed to be here, and everyone could see it, though few paid them more than a glance, dismissing them as a curiosity or anomaly not worth their attention. The alien billionaire, however, could not dismiss them. His eyes had already caught the glimmer on their wrist, but now his gaze lingered, dissecting every detail with ruthless precision. The human carried themselves like someone who had stumbled upon this event by chance, like a child wandering into a fortress of giants. Their movements were awkward, their head turning in sharp angles as they tried to take in the spectacle around them, too quickly, as if overwhelmed and yet unable to resist the allure of so much grandeur. There was no practiced smile, no calculated tilt of the chin, no aura of ownership or entitlement. Instead, there was uncertainty in every step, hesitation in every breath. In a room where every being performed wealth as a language, as a declaration, the human was mute, unable to speak that dialect, and so they stood apart, isolated by their silence. For others, such a presence might have been laughable. A moment of unspoken ridicule passed over drinks and smirks. To the alien billionaire, it was a paradox. The bracelet, forged with rare elements, and engraved with meaning that went deeper than any gem could carry, was not something to be found in the possession of the poor, the lost, the forgotten, and yet, here it was, fastened around the wrist of someone who clearly had no understanding of what they carried. The human's fingers brushed it occasionally, absent-mindedly, not in reverence but in the thoughtless way someone touches an object long familiar. The motion struck him like a blade. This priceless relic, a piece of his history, was nothing more to them than an ordinary accessory, something worn without ceremony. The alien billionaire felt a quiet rage stirring beneath his calm, not because they wore it, but because they wore it without knowing. The crowd gave the human a wide berth, not from hostility but from the same instinct that drives predators to ignore prey too insignificant to bother with. No one feared them, no one courted them, no one sought them out for advantage. They were invisible in a hall designed for spectacle, yet invisibility itself was a kind of shield. shield, and it allowed the human to observe in ways the powerful never could. Their eyes lingered on things others ignored, the way a servant's hands trembled as they balanced a tray of glowing drinks, the quick flicker of coded gestures exchanged between two rival dynasties, the subtle tension in the air whenever a new artifact was revealed. Though they did not understand the full scope of what they saw, there was something sharp in their gaze, something hungry, a kind of awareness born not of privilege but of survival. It was the look of someone used to being small, used to being overlooked, and therefore skilled at watching, absorbing, piecing together truths that the powerful would never bother to hide. The alien billionaire recognized that look. He had worn it himself once, in a time so distant it felt like another life. Long before the fleets, before the empires bent to his will, he had been a shadow on the edge of greatness, watching, learning, gathering every scrap of advantage, until the galaxy had no choice but to acknowledge him. To see that same spark in the eyes of this ragged human was unsettling, a mirror reflecting not his wealth, but his origin. It unsettled him further to realize that the bracelet, his gift, his fragment of history, sat upon the wrist of someone who might one day wield that spark in ways no one could yet predict. The human shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the hall's atmosphere, their hands tightening briefly into fists, as though bracing against an invisible storm. They kept close to the edge of the gathering, careful not to draw attention, though their very difference made them impossible to ignore entirely. A few passing guests glanced their way, their expressions a mix of disdain and amusement, but none lingered. To them, the human was a mistake, an intrusion that would soon be corrected, erased, escorted out by guards once the error was noticed. But the error had not yet been corrected, and so the human remained, a fragile anomaly, clutching unknowingly at the heart of the alien billionaire's past. Every twitch of their fingers across the bracelet's surface, every absent caress, deepened the dissonance in his chest. The gala's light displays shifted, painting the crowd in hues of gold and sapphire, throwing the bracelet into sharper relief. It gleamed like a beacon, its rare alloys catching the glow in ways that defied simple reflection, bending the light as if it had its own gravity. The human's arm moved slightly, adjusting the cuff of their sleeve, and for an instant the alien billionaire saw the piece fully, unobstructed, undeniable. His pulse quickened despite himself, a sensation he had not experienced in centuries. Around him wealth dripped from every surface, but none of it mattered. Not the crystalline storms, not the comet-woven cloaks, not the frozen prisoners turned into trophies. Only this human, this bracelet, this impossible intersection of the forgotten past and the raw present, mattered. He felt the urge to descend from his place of calculated detachment, to walk into the crowd, to close the distance between them, but he restrained himself. Action too soon would draw eyes, and eyes were the one thing he could not allow. Not yet. The human raised a drink to their lips, awkward in their grip, nearly spilling the glowing liquid before managing a clumsy sip. Their face tightened briefly at the taste, unfamiliar with such luxuries, before softening into something that almost looked like wonder. They glanced around again, cautious, nervous, yet there was no shame in their expression, only the quiet resilience of someone who had endured worse than disapproving stares. That resilience struck him as much as the bracelet did. To exist in this place, under this scrutiny, and not collapse entirely was a strength all its own. Perhaps they did not even realize it, but they carried themselves with a dignity that no poverty could erase, a stubborn refusal to break even when the world demanded it. It was that, combined with the relic they bore, that made them more than an anomaly. They were a question, an enigma wrapped in flesh and memory, and for the first time in ages, the alien billionaire felt the sharp pull of a mystery he could not ignore.
The alien billionaire's gaze lingered on the human with the bracelet, but his eyes were no longer seeing only the present. The weight of memory pressed against him, as heavy and unrelenting as the pull of a collapsing star. He had thought himself immune to nostalgia, having buried it beneath centuries of acquisitions, victories, and the careful building of an empire so vast that entire governments bent before him. Yet the bracelet's appearance cracked open that shield, and from the fracture poured recollections he had locked away long ago. He remembered the chamber where the bracelet had been forged, the artisans bending over their tools, the glow of heated alloys swirling with starborn particles. He remembered his voice, low and steady, instructing them not to make it ostentatious but meaningful. Not a declaration of dominance, but a vessel of sentiment. Such requests had startled them, for sentiment was a rarity in one such as him. A man known for his cold precision, his ruthless ambition. But for once, he had desired not to purchase advantage, not to wield wealth as a weapon, but to create something that could carry a fragment of himself, something that could endure when words failed. The memory of who he had given it to emerged slowly, like a shape rising from fog. They had been unlike the others who surrounded him in those days, unimpressed by the vastness of his fleets, unawed by the scale of his holdings, unwilling to bow simply because others did. They had spoken to him not as a god or master but as an equal,
their words cutting through the layers of power to strike something deeper. It had unsettled him at first, for he had been accustomed to deference, to worship disguised as respect. Yet this one had offered neither fear nor envy, only honesty, only presence. In them he had found something he had almost forgotten could exist, connection unshaped by power. The bracelet had been his gesture, his attempt to capture that connection, to bind it in material form. He had placed it in their hands with words he could barely remember now, though the emotion behind them still lingered, raw and unfinished. That moment had been rare, uncalculated, almost reckless. He had given a part of himself away, not expecting it to return. But return it had, though not in the way he had ever imagined. Seeing it now on the wrist of this ragged human was like witnessing a ghost step into the present, a reminder that history never truly dies, it only waits. The alien billionaire's mind whirled with questions. Had the one to whom he gave it passed it down? Had it been stolen, traded, lost in the endless shuffle of time until it landed here like driftwood upon a strange shore? Or was there something deeper, something hidden in the human's very presence that explained this impossibility? The possibilities tangled within him, each one stirring emotions he did not wish to name. Suspicion coiled tightly around curiosity, but beneath them both throbbed a sharper ache, the pang of loss, of remembering what once was, and knowing it could never be again. He recalled the day they had parted, the one he had trusted enough to receive that gift. It had not ended in betrayal, nor in triumph, but in inevitability. Their paths had diverged, his consumed by empire and conquest, theirs by choices he had not followed. He had let them go, perhaps believing that in the endless churn of years the memory would fade, and it had, or so he thought. Yet the bracelet's presence proved otherwise. It was as if the past itself had clawed its way into the present, refusing to be silenced. He remembered their face, not in perfect detail, but in fragments, in the way light had touched their eyes, in the cadence of their voice, in the rare feeling that when they looked at him, they saw not the emperor of wealth but the man beneath. Those memories were sharper than he had expected, sharper than time should have allowed, and they cut him now as they once had soothed him. The human's awkwardness, their fragility in this hall of titans, reminded him of that presence too. They carried none of the arrogance that saturated the crowd, none of the desperation to prove themselves through wealth and spectacle. Instead, they moved with quiet resilience, enduring the weight of eyes that dismissed them. In that resilience, faint and unrefined, he saw an echo of the one who had once worn the bracelet before. It was not likeness of form but likeness of spirit, as though some hidden thread bound them together across centuries. The thought unsettled him further, pressing against the logic that had always guided his life. He was a creature of calculation, of order, of control, yet this felt like neither coincidence nor accident. It felt like design, like inevitability, as though the galaxy itself had conspired to bring this relic of his past before him again, carried by hands too small to comprehend its weight. Around him, the gala surged on, indifferent to his silence. Yet within him, the clash of memory and reality thundered. He had not allowed himself to dwell on such things for so long because they weakened him, distracted him from the relentless pursuit of power. But now, with the bracelet gleaming in the artificial starlight, with the human shifting nervously under its unnoticed burden, he could not turn away. The questions gnawed at him. Was this a message, a test, or merely chance? What had become of the one who had first received his gift? Did this human know them, descend from them, or carry their shadow unknowingly? Every possibility threatened to unravel the careful control he held over himself. He wanted to dismiss it, to wave it away as nothing, but the sight of the bracelet would not let him. It was not nothing. It could never be nothing. He closed his eyes briefly, though only for an instant, allowing the memories to surge fully before forcing them back down. He remembered the warmth of giving, the strange vulnerability of it, the way it had frightened him more than battle, more than loss. He remembered the silence that followed when they were gone, the hollow that wealth could not fill, the way he had buried it beneath layers of acquisition and empire, until it became almost myth within his own mind. Now seeing it returned, he realized the myth had been real all along. The past had not died, only slept, and now it had awakened in the most unlikely form. The alien billionaire opened his eyes again, his gaze sharp, his composure unbroken outwardly, but within him the storm raged. The bracelet was more than metal and stone. It was memory made manifest, a relic not only of another person but of another version of himself, a version he had long since abandoned. And seeing it here, born by this fragile human, forced him to confront the truth he had avoided for centuries, that the past does not release us simply because we will it so, and that some gifts carry with them a weight no time, no empire, no fortune can erase. Suspicion wrapped itself around the alien billionaire's mind, like a constricting serpent, each coil tighter than the last, as he studied the human more closely. For one of his treasures to appear here, in this hall of empires, on the wrist of someone so lowly, there had to be an explanation, and none of them were simple. His first thought was theft.
Perhaps the bracelet had been stolen from its rightful place, snatched from some collector or merchant who had unknowingly come into possession of it after it vanished from his own past. That possibility carried a certain logic, but when he considered the human's demeanor, their awkward shifting, their ill-fitting clothes, their lack of the arrogance typical of thieves who managed to survive long enough to flaunt their gains, it did not fit. They did not radiate cunning, nor the satisfaction of someone wearing plunder. Instead, they wore the bracelet without awareness, without recognition of its worth, as though it were a thing as ordinary as a scrap of cloth, or a simple trinket, and that dissonance gnawed at him. The second possibility was inheritance. Perhaps the one to whom he had given it had passed it on, across generations, until at last it reached this moment. The thought stirred emotions he resisted, for it suggested continuity, legacy, survival beyond his knowledge. Could it be that this human was a descendant, blood tied to the one who had once held his heart with nothing but presence and truth? The possibility lingered, tantalizing and dangerous, yet he could not grasp it fully. The human did not look like them, nor did they carry themselves with the same fire, the same deliberate defiance that had drawn him so long ago. No, they seemed smaller, rougher, unpolished by any great destiny. But then again, destiny was not always visible. He himself had been overlooked once, dismissed as nothing before he rose to eclipse those who had scorned him. Could this human carry the same unseen potential, hidden beneath the ragged surface? The bracelet's presence whispered yes, but logic demanded doubt. Another thought came, colder and sharper. Perhaps the human was being used. Perhaps some rival had placed the bracelet upon their wrist deliberately, knowing it would catch his eye, knowing it would stir questions and emotions he preferred buried. The gala was not merely a display of wealth, it was a battlefield of influence, and weapons came in many forms. Could this human be a pawn, a lure meant to drag him into vulnerability? The idea carried weight. He could almost imagine a rival watching from the shadows, savoring the possibility that he might react, that his carefully maintained composure might crack before these predators disguised as peers. But if that were true, then the pawn himself knew nothing of it, for the human's eyes betrayed only confusion and awe, no hint of cunning manipulation. They were too raw, too lost in the spectacle of the hall to be an accomplice to such schemes. Yet even as suspicion whispered its poisons, fascination pushed against it. He should have dismissed the matter as beneath him, should have turned his gaze elsewhere, should have treated the human as invisible as the others did. That was the safer path, the rational path. But he could not. The bracelet bound his attention, chaining him to a question that clawed deeper with every passing moment. Who was this human, and how had they come to hold a piece of his past? His golden eyes followed them through the crowd, marking every movement, every hesitation, every clumsy gesture. He read their posture the way others read financial reports, searching for answers in the curve of their shoulders, the tremor of their hands, the darting of their gaze. They were no master of deception, no calculated actor. Their authenticity was almost painful to witness. In a room of lies, this human was unguarded truth, and it unnerved him more than any scheme could. He imagined approaching them, imagined asking the question directly, imagined hearing the answer that might explain everything. But with that imagination came danger. If he crossed the distance now, others would notice, and the attention of others was a currency he did not spend lightly. To reveal his interest in a single human, a nobody, would spark whispers, would fuel rumors that could twist into vulnerabilities, and yet to do nothing was its own form of torment. Every second he remained still, the mystery deepened, pressing harder against the walls of his mind. His curiosity was not the idle kind that others toyed with. It was sharp, consuming, relentless. It had driven him once to conquer markets, to crush rivals, to stretch his grasp across galaxies. Now it turned inward, aimed at a single fragile life, and the relic they bore without comprehension. He remembered the lessons of his youth, when he had been nothing, when survival had depended on watching, on waiting, on knowing when to strike and when to vanish. This moment demanded patience, demanded calculation, yet his blood stirred with impatience he had not felt in centuries. It was not merely about the bracelet anymore, it was about meaning. The universe, vast and chaotic, rarely offered meaning freely, yet here it was, gleaming on the wrist of someone who should not matter, and in that gleam lay a story he could not ignore. The alien billionaire felt the old hunger rising, the hunger not for wealth or dominion, but for understanding, for connection, for the raw, unshaped truth that no empire could purchase. The human shifted closer to one of the food towers, their fingers hovering uncertainly over dishes that changed color with every breath. They selected nothing, perhaps afraid of offending, perhaps afraid of being noticed. The bracelet caught the light again, refracting it into 1,000 subtle hues, and he felt the echo of the moment when he had first given it away, when his own hand had closed around a wrist so different and yet so alike. The sensation burned in him, an ache buried too long, now exposed and raw. He clenched his jaw, mastering the storm within, but his eyes did not waver. He had to know, was this human a thief, a descendant, a pawn, or something beyond even those categories? Each possibility carried danger, But danger had never deterred him. It had built him, forged him, sharpened him into the creature who now ruled not only wealth, but memory itself. The crowd shifted again, laughter rising like a tide, but he remained apart, silent, calculating. Around him, deals were struck. Empires shifted subtly in their foundations, yet he was consumed by a single enigma. The suspicion that had first clawed at him was still there, whispering caution, demanding vigilance, but fascination had grown stronger, heavier, impossible to suppress. For the first time in an age, he found himself facing something he could not quantify, could not purchase, could not reduce to numbers or advantage, and that, above all else, was what bound him to the human before him, as inexorably as the bracelet bound the past to the present. The alien billionaire's decision was made in silence, invisible to the watching crowd, hidden behind the mask of composure he had perfected over centuries. Outwardly, he remained the same towering presence, aloof, untouchable, a figure whose wealth and power placed him beyond the reach of ordinary intrigue. But within, the storm had settled into a single current, a choice that pulled him forward with an inevitability he could neither ignore nor escape. He would confront the human, not out of fury, for though anger simmered in the recognition of his past trinket worn so casually, it was not rage that drove him, nor was it vengeance, for no crime had yet been proven, no insult beyond the silent clash of memory and ignorance. What compelled him was curiosity sharpened into obsession, the need to pierce the veil of coincidence and discover the truth beneath. He did not move immediately. Patience was the lifeblood of predators, and he had not risen to his throne of power by lunging recklessly at every temptation. He waited, his eyes locked on the human as the tide of guests shifted around them, as servants floated past with trays of glowing delicacies, as the orchestra's alien instruments wove melodies meant to drown thought in euphoria. The human remained as they had been, uncomfortable, hesitant, clutching a drink too tightly, their wrist flashing faintly whenever the bracelet caught the engineered starlight overhead. No one else noticed, no one else cared, and yet to him it was the axis upon which the entire gala now turned. He let his thoughts sharpen, let the questions simmer until they formed a blade, so that when he did approach, every word, every gesture would be calculated to cut directly to the truth. When at last he descended from his elevated platform, it was without flourish, without spectacle. His movements were precise, controlled, so that the crowd instinctively parted, not because he demanded it openly, but because his presence compelled it. Beings of wealth and power stepped aside with murmurs of respect or fear, their eyes following him, their thoughts racing with speculation. For the alien billionaire to move with purpose was rare, and every rival in the room tried to measure what target had drawn his gaze. None of them guessed the truth, for their eyes did not see the human as his did. To them the figure was invisible, beneath notice, swallowed by insignificance. Their failure to see made the moment even sharper, for he knew that when his attention fixed on something, it was never without reason, and now his reason was a single human in rags, a fragile anomaly clutching a fragment of his past. The human noticed him only gradually, their eyes lifting with the uncertain awareness of prey sensing the approach of something vast and unknowable. Confusion flickered across their features first, then unease, then the raw edge of fear. They did not understand why the crowd shifted, why whispers followed in the wake of this alien's passage, but instinct screamed that someone important was drawing near. Their grip on the glass tightened, their posture stiffened, and the bracelet shifted slightly as their hand trembled. The alien billionaire saw it all, every twitch, every flicker, every pulse of life written in their body language, and it only deepened his curiosity. Fear was natural, inevitable, but beneath it there was no guile, no calculated pretense. They looked at him not as a rival, not as a subject, but as a being confronting something far larger than themselves, and in that look he found echoes of honesty that cut deeper than all the false smiles around them. He stopped before them, the air itself thickening as silence spread outward in a ripple, though no one dared intrude upon the moment. His eyes dropped once more to the bracelet, then rose to meet the human's gaze. The distance between them was small now, but the gulf of power was vast, and both of them felt it. The human swallowed, uncertain, perhaps on the edge of speaking, perhaps on the edge of fleeing, though neither seemed possible under the weight of his presence. He considered the words he might use, the tone he might strike. He could demand answers, could unleash the full force of his authority to tear the truth from them, but that would destroy the delicate mystery before him. He did not want submission, he wanted revelation, and revelations, he knew, were not extracted by force but drawn out, piece by piece, like secrets coaxed from shadows. He leaned closer, his voice low, carrying the resonance of power but softened with a curiosity that startled even himself. He asked nothing about wealth, nothing about power, nothing about the gala that surrounded them. His words cut directly to the bracelet, to the history it carried, to the story that had somehow delivered it into their hands. The human blinked, startled by the directness of the question, by the fact that this towering figure, feared by all others, had chosen to speak to them at all. Their lips parted, hesitated,
and for a moment he saw the struggle within them, the desire to answer, the fear of speaking wrong, the confusion of being thrust into significance without warning. When their voice finally emerged, it was soft, unsteady, but unguarded. They spoke not as a pawn reciting lines, not as a thief weaving lies, but as someone simply telling what they knew. The alien billionaire listened with intensity, each word dissected, measured, weighed against his memory. The human spoke of how they had come into possession of the bracelet, of how it had been passed to them, not as treasure, but as inheritance, a keepsake from hands long gone. They did not know its true worth, did not know the history of its making, or the gravity of the one who had first given it. To them it was memory, nothing more, a piece of family carried not for wealth but for meaning, and that meaning, though small in their understanding, resonated with him in ways that shattered his composure. For in their story, fragmented and simple, he heard the echo of his own past, the faint trace of the one he had once trusted, the proof that the gift had not been lost but carried, preserved, treasured in ways he had never imagined. The revelation struck him like a blow, though he let none of it show outwardly. His face remained calm, unreadable, but inside, something cracked. He had given the bracelet as a gesture of connection, and across the span of centuries, that connection had not died. It had transformed, shifted, endured through lives and generations, until it rested here, on the wrist of a human who knew nothing of empires or wealth, but carried it all the same. It was not theft, not mockery, not manipulation. It was legacy, living and unbroken, staring back at him through wide, uncertain eyes. And in that recognition, the alien billionaire felt something he had not allowed himself in. So long he had almost forgotten its shape, the sting of vulnerability, the ache of memory made flesh, the possibility that beneath the empire of power he had built, there still existed a man who once gave a gift not to control, but simply to mean.
The silence between them stretched, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. The human shifted under his gaze, uncertain what answer they had given, uncertain what judgment might fall upon them. Around them the gala continued, oblivious, but to him, the hall, the riches, the posturing of the powerful had all dissolved into nothing. There was only the bracelet, the human, and the undeniable truth that his past had returned in a form he could neither deny nor control. And in that moment his decision deepened, not only to confront, but to remain, to learn, to follow this thread of legacy wherever it might lead, no matter how dangerous, no matter how unsettling. For the first time in ages he was not master of the story, but participant in it, and that realization filled him with a fire he thought long dead. The alien billionaire stood in silence, golden eyes fixed on the fragile figure before him, and the room seemed to fade until only the bracelet and the human remained. The orchestra's song became a distant hum, the glittering wealth around them a blur of irrelevance. For the first time in centuries, power felt weightless, stripped away by something as simple as legacy carried unknowingly by trembling hands. The human shifted uneasily, but did not step back, their wrists trembling as the ancient gift gleamed. He reached forward, hesitation ghosting his movements, as though touching the past might shatter him,